Truly, there are few prospects more terrifying than that of nuclear war. Something that, in its worst and most deadly iteration, could well have the potential to not just end advanced human civilization as we know it, but potentially all human life, period. But at least it's never happened, right? After all, nuclear weapons were used in World War II, and after seeing just how truly devastating they were, the button was never pushed ever again. Or so the story goes. And, well, yeah, that is true, thank God. That doesn't mean we haven't come really close to crossing the nuclear Rubicon. Usually by accident, but also, and perhaps more shockingly still, intentionally, with the occasional general seemingly not have gotten the memo after World War II. It is a prospect that is every bit as fascinating as it is terrifying, and so today, we are going to be satisfying that curiosity by having a look at 5 times that the nukes were nearly launched. Even by Cold War standards, the US and the USSR weren't exactly getting along come the 1980s. In 1979 alone, for example, the former had deployed RSD-10 Pioneer medium-range nuclear missiles capable of striking targets in West Germany, France, and the UK in less than 10 minutes to its western border in response to a NATO condemnation of its invasion of Afghanistan the same year, and in turn the US had adopted its so-called double-track decision in December, which called for the deployment of Pershing II medium-range nuclear missiles, themselves capable of hitting targets in Ukraine, Belarus, or Lithuania in sub 10 minutes, should talks to see the aforementioned RSDs removed from Europe fail. This, naturally, was a bit of a tense situation, and what was needed in response was for calm heads to prevail on both sides of the Iron Curtain, so that the superpowers could sit down at the same table, talk it out like adults, and find a way to step back from the nuclear brink with both of their dignities and, indeed, the planet intact. Now, this being the Cold War, however, that's not what happened, and instead, what happened was chest beating aplenty on both sides, with the US going out of its way to probe Soviet radar systems by flying bombers right towards Moscow and other important targets, only to pull them away just before they entered Soviet airspace. Soviets, for their part, did exactly the same to NATO countries in return. What the world really didn't need amidst all of that was for an early warning satellite to take a peculiar turn and start falsely reporting that the other team had lit the match on some of its missiles. As with things the way they were, the powers that be were far more likely to take leave of their senses and order an immediate and full retaliation in response. Alas, on the 26th of September 1983, that is exactly what happened, as one of the Soviets' Oko early warning satellites being monitored from an apocalypse-proof bunker near Moscow suddenly started saying that it had identified a single missile launching from the continental United States, and then 4 more mere moments later. Sat at the console was one Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. According to the regulations, he should have phoned it in to his superiors immediately to give them all the time they needed to get every possible missile out of its silo and every possible bomber into the air so that they could make damn sure that if they were going down, America was going to go down with them. Luckily, however, Petrov was one of God's thinkers, and so he sat there with a phone in his hand, being well aware of exactly what was at stake as he took a brief moment to consider the situation logically, and quickly happened upon the realization the launch of merely 5 missiles just didn't make sense. The Americans knew that if they launched even 1 missile, they'd be getting the Soviets' entire arsenal in return, so surely they would go all out. Sensing that something was amiss, Petrov then went to compare the data his Oko satellite was feeding him with data from over-the-horizon radar installations, which showed, well, nothing. With that, the phone was placed back in its receiver, and the world was saved, with it later being found out that the false alarm was triggered by an unusual alignment of sunlight reflecting off of high-altitude clouds. It's a good thing that he was so level-headed too, because at that time, the Soviet leader was one Yuri Andropov, a former KGB man who harbored a deep mistrust of his American equivalent, and if the incorrect data had been relayed to him, well, let's just say a reasoned and well-considered response would have been rather unlikely. Nuclear weapons may have also been dangerously close to being deployed in the Korean War too, and we can't stress the word may enough, as it's quite the unclear and contentious matter all in in all, certainly there is no doubt that the US was willing to use them, as on the 1st of August 1950, the 9th Bomb Wing of the US Air Force, which was equipped with 10 B-29 bombers, each carrying a single Mark IV atomic bomb apiece, was dispatched to Guam, where they were to stay on standby as a so-called atomic task force, one that was primed and ready to go should the call come down. Knowing that, the question is less would they have done it, and more under what conditions would they have done it? It's also a question that revolves around one man, and that would be Douglas MacArthur, the chief of United Nations forces in Korea, and many argue that he was pretty enthusiastic to smash that big red button. What is known for certain is that on the 9th of December 1950, he requested authority as a field commander to deploy atomic bombs as he saw fit, albeit stressing that he only wished to use them if the United Nations forces were pushed back to the point of being routed from the peninsula. And he didn't want to just use them on North Korea and Chinese troops on the peninsula either, as 15 days later, on Christmas Eve in fact, he submitted a list of prospective targets to the Pentagon. We won't worry about what he called these, as he used a word that has aged very badly, but we will worry about what his aim was: to decimate both North Korea and China so extensively that continued military resistance became impossible, and for this, he had chalked up 34 targets. With time, some of the Joint Chiefs became so concerned over the prospect of MacArthur getting a bit trigger-happy with the nukes that in 1951 they completely pulled the 9th Bomb Wing from his roster and instead handed it to Strategic Air Command, an organization that had absolutely nothing to do with MacArthur. As a result, there were no blurry grey lines, no middlemen of unclear authority, just the president that would give the order, the B-29s that would execute it, and a single direct line of command and communication between the two. Eventually, MacArthur was stripped of his command altogether on the 11th of April, and so the matter became moot. But would he have actually done it? Well, that's the question we need to get to the bottom of. And unfortunately, it's a question where there's really no clear answer, even 70 years after the fact. For example, MacArthur himself swore under oath before a Senate inquiry after the war that he had never explicitly recommended their use, and had also publicly admonished Truman in 1960 when the former president had suggested that he had. But then, on the flip side, he said this in a 1954 interview, quoting here, "I could have won the war in Korea in a maximum of 10 days. I would have dropped between 30 and 50 atomic bombs on his air bases and other depots strung across the neck of Manchuria. It was my plan, as our amphibious forces moved south to spread behind us from the Sea of Japan to the Yellow Sea, a belt of radioactive cobalt. It could have been spread from wagons, carts, trucks, and planes. For at least 60 years, there could have been no land invasion of Korea from the north. The enemy could not have marched across that radiated belt." But it gets more complicated still, because while at this point we might be tempted to write MacArthur off as a Dr. Strangelove character made real, both Presidents Nixon and Kennedy later claimed that he had urged extreme caution and hesitancy in deploying nuclear weapons when offering them personal counsel. Ultimately, we simply don't know for certain. Someone was lying, that is definitely clear, but as to who it was, it's likely we'll never know, as the primary sources just have so many contradictory claims. Our next nuclear near-miss actually occurred after the Cold War, specifically on the 25th of January 1995. It was caused by the launch of a Black Brant 12 rocket from the Andøya rocket range in Norway. It wasn't even a military mission, with the rocket in question being a simple research rocket whose only payload was a load of measuring equipment, and the people who launched it, they were but humble American and Norwegian scientists who were eagerly anticipating learning all manner of interesting things about the Aurora Borealis over Svalbard. Unbeknownst to them, however, their rocket, launched from where it was, with the trajectory that it had, just happened to coincide with a corridor that the Russians predicted the Americans would use if they were to launch the minimum 3 ICBMs that they had in their North Dakota silo, and were aiming them at Moscow. It got worse still, however, because when the Olenegorsk early warning radar station in Murmansk Oblast detected the Black Brant, to them, the speed and flight pattern resembled that of a US Navy submarine-launched Trident ICBM, particularly if the US was trying to get the drop on Russia with an atmospheric detonation, the kind that would create an EMP effect that would devastate their electrical infrastructure and leave the whole country's defense grid blind. Neither of these interpretations left a clean pair of underpants, and so the alert was raised, escalated through the military's hierarchy, and eventually found its way to then-President Boris Yeltsin. Fearing the worst, he immediately had Szeged, the nuclear briefcase that allowed him to communicate instantaneously with all of Russia's nuclear forces from anywhere in the world, primed, and with it he ordered all of his submarine commanders to ready their missiles and all of his bombers to get fueled up and into the air before then sitting down to watch the situation develop with his top military advisors. For 8 minutes they sat there, Yeltsin ready and willing to give the green light if he deemed it necessary. Fortunately, the Black Brant then began to veer away from Russian airspace, and thus it was deemed that whatever it was no longer posed a threat, and so the country's nuclear forces were stood down. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Why didn't the scientists just inform Russia of what they were doing to prevent exactly the situation from happening? Well, funny thing is, they did, as well as 29 other countries, in fact. But unfortunately, 90s Russia was, how to put this eloquently, it's a bit of a mess, and as a result, the scientists' heads up never reached where it needed to go, having gotten lost in a sea of incompetent bureaucracy, with some sources even saying that the report was passed solely to the Russian Coast Guard and Civilian Shipping Authority after it had been interpreted as a warning to shipping as to where the rocket might end up landing. If that sounds unbelievable, find your nearest Russian and ask them for their memories of the 90s. It was a wild time, and that is putting it mildly. 1979, as we have already discussed, was a year when tensions started to really build up between the US and the USSR after a series of unfortunate events that began with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. What we haven't already discussed, however, was that 1979 also had its own nuclear near-miss separate to all of that, and it happens at the North American Air Defense Command, or NORAD, a binational military command between the US and Canada that monitors and defends the two nations' airspace and provides early warnings of potential threats from the air, space, or sea. As for what caused the near miss, that would just be a simple computer glitch. It was 3 a.m. when the display screens at NORAD Shire Mountain Complex in Colorado decided to go haywire. One moment, everything was quiet. Next, the screens lit up with a chilling message that 250 Soviet ICBMs were en route to turn the US into an atomic wasteland. Naturally, this little late-night surprise immediately put the US on full alert. The data got forwarded to every big-name command center that you can think of: the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, Strategic Air Command Headquarters, the alternate National Military Command Center. The whole lot were immediately informed and put on high alert, with bombers being put into the air and missiles being primed ready to launch. Even the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, the plane that serves as the president's flying apocalypse-proof war room, was prepared for takeoff. Luckily, in what is a recurring theme in nuclear near misses, a logical approach was chosen, with the powers that be wanting to make absolutely certain that the missiles were both real and coming their way before they ordered a full retaliation. And much like it happened to Stanislav Petrov, supplementary ground-based radar systems and satellite data was checked, which showed nothing at all. Not a single missile, just empty sky. They sat it out a few minutes just to be sure, and when sufficient time had passed to make it clear that no missiles were inbound, about 7 minutes, a big breath was taken by everybody, no doubt, and America's nuclear arsenal was stood down. So, what happened? And the answer to that could just be about the worst one that we've seen yet, as this wasn't even caused by a civilian rocket that they were ignorant of, or an early warning satellite getting a duff reading off of some unforeseen weather condition. No. Instead, it was caused by human error, as some bright spark had loaded the wrong tape into the NORAD computer, specifically one that was meant to be used for training exercises, and made the computer simulate the Russians launching a full surprise attack. Knowing that, we suspect that said training tape went missing shortly afterwards, the only hint as to where it ended up being a single poor recruit who was walking like John Wayne for weeks afterwards. As far as nuclear flashpoints go, there was probably none greater than the Cuban Missile Crisis, when, for 13 terrifying days in October 1962, the US and the USSR locked horns over a load of R-12 medium-range and R-14 intermediate-range nuclear missiles that the Soviets had plonked in the crisis's titular country. The story is a well-told one. Lots of fear, lots of chest beating, and the USSR eventually pledging to remove its missiles from Cuba openly in exchange for the US removing some of its missiles from Turkey secretly, all while their nuclear arsenals were primed and pointed at one another, ready to go at a moment's notice. But that synopsis, while terrifying enough in its own right, is actually just part of the story. Because in the shadows, or more specifically under the waves, as the broader crisis played out, there was a far, far closer shave with nuclear Armageddon. It happened on the 27th of October, aboard B-59, a Soviet Project 641 class submarine that was packing a little something extra, a T-5 nuclear-tipped torpedo. It very nearly launched it. Nuclear torpedoes, in case you don't know, are a uniquely terrifying sort of weapon. Quite literally just being a normal torpedo, but with a nuclear payload, they can be deployed to outright destroy multiple ships that they catch in their blast, both surface and submerged, as well as destroy countless more as they create waves of such intense force and pressure that ships caught in it simply crack and fall apart. As for how B-59 came to nearly launch its T-5, that would be because the US Navy was blockading Cuba during the crisis, and to prevent said blockade from being circumvented, all submarines that were detected were ordered to surface and identify themselves, and this was communicated by dropping of reduced-yield training depth charges in their vicinity. Doing so was a well-understood practice, but unfortunately, conditions aboard B-59 weren't exactly conducive to keeping a clear head. In fact, they were basically akin to a living nightmare, having been submerged for days and thus being unable to recharge batteries, take on fresh air, or vent heat. As a result, oxygen was running low, carbon dioxide was building up, and the crew was sweaty and exhausted. And none were affected by those terrible conditions more than the B-59's captain, Valentin Savitsky. In his stressed state, when depth charges started detonating around him, he was convinced that his submarine was under attack and that it was go time as a result, a situation that wasn't helped by his being cut off from Moscow and thus having no idea if a wider attack was underway. Finally, snapping under the pressure, he declared, quote, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our navy." Now, while there might have been a jolly exciting declaration, in Soviet doctrine, the call actually wasn't his to make, with the deployment of nuclear weapons being such a big deal that it could only be done with a unanimous agreement of all senior officers on board. At that time, there were 3 such officers, and while the B-59's political commissar, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed, the 2IC, Vasily Arkhipov, did not. He reasoned that such an extreme choice should only be made following clear orders, and after much screaming across the sub's bridge, Maslenikov and Savitsky came around to his way of thinking. Then, with nothing else to be done, the B-59 surfaced, was told by the US Navy that no war had started, and that was that. World-ending crisis averted. The Soviets were, as you'd expect, quite keen to keep what had nearly happened aboard the B-59 under wraps, and so the story was hidden, and its protagonist gagged for 40 years, with Arkhipov's world-saving heroics only coming to the surface, pun intended, during a conference that marked the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 2002. Sadly, Arkhipov had passed away only 4 years prior, and so he never got to know the reverence with which he is now regarded. But for what it's worth, Arkhipov, if you happen to get YouTube in heaven, on behalf of every human of your time today and from the future, all of whom live only because of your decision, well, thanks a lot.